Good morning. I'm T.Y. Chang from TYT Investigates. I'm the climate change reporter, and we are going to be discussing today the Joe Biden's clean energy revolution, basically his climate change plans, what that will be, and then we'll discuss it and we'll compare a little bit of it, in any case, to what Bernie Sanders had proposed and how it's such an important part of the young vote. Uh, let's see, I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me. If I change the microphone, so hopefully this will work better. But I think last time it was more a problem of the streaming YouTube signal as opposed to my microphone. But I did change it anyway, just in case. So, in any case, let's start. So Joe Biden, as his energy program certainly is not as comprehensive as Bernie Sanders was. For example, Joe Biden's energy plans cost roughly about $1.7 trillion if he were to do everything that he plans to do. Bernie Sanders' plan cost 10 times as much, nearly 10 times as much, $16 trillion, which a lot of people questioned, but Bernie Sanders was saying this is the only way that you can actually address the issue and deal with climate change before it becomes catastrophic. Okay, so what exactly did what exactly did Joe Biden say for his clean energy revolution? He called it. He called the Green New Deal, quote, a crucial framework. So did not support the Green New Deal, but he called it a crucial framework. He said that two things about it were really important. Basically, some principles saying that number one, the U.S. had to have greater ambition in dealing with climate change, and number two, the environment and the economy were definitely connected. So he said he called it a crucial framework. That's basically what he's saying, that he's not going to support it completely. I think we have to keep in mind that while on one hand, Joe Biden has to appeal to young people to get out and vote more than they did in 2016, and certainly to get out to vote to defeat Donald Trump. On the other hand, he has to deal with some Republicans, moderate Republicans, who could vote for him over Donald Trump, but may not if his anti-pollution and pro-climate change proposals are viewed as too extreme. So he's sort of caught there, the politics of that. But one of the things Biden said, he wanted to revitalize the United States energy sector. How would he do that? He wants to boost the growth of the economy through manufacturing, creating the U.S. into what he would call, in broad terms, a superpower of clean energy. So to begin manufacturing a lot of the clean energy, my first thought was that in terms of manufacturing, in particular for solar panels, in any case, China is way ahead of the United States and is supplying most of the world right now in terms of solar panels. But that doesn't mean it cannot be the United States in terms of research and development. One of the great things about the United States has always been its innovation. I'll give you a quick story on that. A number of years ago, a Japanese national who had emigrated from Japan to study at, I think it was MIT, won the Nobel Prize in biology. And he said, had I stayed in Japan, I never would have won the Nobel Prize. And he said, part of the reason is cultural. He said, in the United States, there's an individualist tendency and a pioneer spirit that goes along with scientific inquiry, in the sense that you will challenge the existing knowledge and say, well, I don't think this is right, or this is wrong, or that's right. Where you said in Japan, you always have deference toward the senior professors. And so when you challenge them, that's considered culturally wrong. Whereas in the US, challenging your seniors is considered a good thing. And because of that, that's also good for science, in the sense that if you challenge the existing body of knowledge, that you'll be more innovative. And the U.S. has been a great innovator in the past in terms of, inventing the computer, developing, videotape recordings, television, etc. A lot of the newest innovations, the computer, think about that. The U.S. really invented it where it became also the basics, not necessarily all the basics, but definitely the working computer and also the what you call the laptops and the smaller computers and I'm not sure about the smartphones, but the point was the U.S. Has been very good in innovation, and that's something we should continue. Although under the Trump administration and under the Bush administrations, they reduced the amount of research and development they did, and the number of research papers by the U.S. declined, and those by scientific papers by China actually increased the U.S. So that's something that certainly seems to be a good idea that the U.S. should consider research and development. So the Biden plan, getting back to that, said he wants a 100% clean energy economy. And here is one of the key differences. In the Biden plan, he says he wants a 100% clean energy economy and net zero emissions by 2050. Now, 2050 is the date chosen by the UN and a number of other scientists. That's the critical date of no return. So basically, Joe Biden is saying, okay, we're going to do this by 2050, but that's the point where most of the scientists are now saying, if you don't do it by 2050, it's the point of no return. The Earth, human beings on Earth will be extinct. So that seems to be not really a good date to choose, the last second before humans become extinct. And maybe you could do it a little bit earlier, like 10 years or 20 years earlier, but at least 10 years. Personal opinion, not scientific. Second thing in his plan was in the infrastructure. They want to develop a clean energy infrastructure, that as we rebuild the U.S. infrastructure, that there has to be a clean one, in the sense that, okay, if you're going to put a lot of money in infrastructure, it's not putting in money to build necessarily just airports, but put in money to develop and build more wind and solar and hydro power and the geothermal eco parks that provide more energy, and that could be used in manufacturing to basically rebuild our clean economy. A third thing in the Biden plan would be to call a rally, a world rally. That well, first thing he said, on day one, he would go back and re-sign to the Paris Agreement on climate change, and he said he would want to use American economic leverage to stop other countries from cheating. The two other world polluters are China and India, which are developing economies. And although, oddly enough, China is developed the most in solar energy, it pales in comparison to how much energy it uses or creates by coal industry. In fact, it's a huge portion. The majority is still coal. Although it's reducing and solar power is going up, it's still solar power is minuscule compared to the coal generated plants in China and India. And so the fourth thing is that he would make sure that the U.S. fossil fuel companies don't harm the environment, which is the opposite of what the Trump administration is doing right now. Clearly, the Trump administration, one after the other, eviscerating the EPA, Department of Interior, reducing the emissions controls, allowing now saying that if you pollute during this pandemic, it's okay because the industry has to get back, cutting back on the mercury pollution, cutting back on the restrictions on mercury pollution, trichlorofluoride. So the fifth thing would be to fulfill obligations to communities of color in particular, that there would be no more pollution in those areas. And that's one of the key parts of the Biden Green Plan. And the other part would be to roll back all the Trump tax incentives for fossil fuel companies, for corporations, that Biden basically says in his statement on green plans that hurt jobs and the environment. Now, he did talk about how the greenhouse effect, acknowledging the greenhouse effect and global warming, basically, although he didn't use the term global warming, he said greenhouse effect, that humans have raised the temperature 1 degree centigrade, and it should not go to 1.5 degrees. In particular, he mentioned a number of things that environmentalists talk about all the time, that if it reaches 1.5, well, it's already started, but critical masses at 1.5 degrees centigrade, raising the temperature of the world, in terms of warming oceans, melting the ice sheet, melting glaciers, raising, the sea levels and the ocean levels to the point where a lot of coastal, not just coastal cities, but entire coastal states could be flooded. And he talked about that. He said on day one that he would, again, re-sign to the Paris Climate Accord. He would try to limit methane pollution by executive orders, by executive action. He would try, this is all day one stuff, to make sure that all U.S. government begin the process of making sure all U.S. government vehicles are 100% clean energy, zero emissions. Push for U.S. government buildings to be, quote, efficient. No particular goal set there or timetable, but he said the idea is to push toward it. I'm sure a number of environmentalists would want an actual figure, an actual date to go for. So by the way, I can see your comments on the chats now, and we will respond to those in a few minutes. Just go through some more of this. He's also wanted to preserve the Clean Air Act, which we have to wonder whether Donald Trump, what the next step with that would be for the Trump administration. Push for more biofuel. Not sure if that would include burning wood for as a biofuel plants. That's the majority of biofuel plants actually burn timber, which Michael Moore or Jeff Gibbs and executive producer Michael Moore of Planet of the Humans pointing out that doesn't seem to be a terrific idea when we need more trees to reduce the greenhouse effect. One example was that in Pakistan, where they noticed that the temperature was rising to the point that it was barely survivable. And this is in a country that does not have air conditioning. And certainly air conditioning would just still put more heat into the atmosphere. The Pakistan realized they had cut down too many trees for the farms. So they began a tree planting campaign and planted, in fact, millions and millions of trees. And they have found that it has, in fact, reduced the temperature in Pakistan significantly. I don't know the exact numbers. I should try and look that up. But so biofuels may not be the best way to go there. He's also on day one pushing for more efficient appliances, protect the environment, and also to protect biodiversity, which is a critical importance even for pandemics, because during pandemics, we know one thing that scientists are examining is that with a shrinking wildlife habitat, more and more wildlife interact and then spread more diseases between each other, and then those reach humans through the wet markets, which should be banned probably, or definitely. And then to protect biodiversity on day one, Joe Biden says that he would conserve 30% of American lands and waters by 2030. Conserve meaning that to protect the national parks, et cetera. But he said lands and water. So I don't know how far out he's talking about. Is he talking about the 200 nautical miles for the border, the international border? Does he include that? If that's 30% of the U.S. land and water, that doesn't really protect a lot of the land. Restore and protect national wildlife. Within 1 year, Joe Biden says he would aim for net zero emissions by 2050 again. There's that. In his first year, he's saying he would push for that again. You have to question, a number of environmentalists probably would question 2050 is pushing it to the very, very end. He does say that he intends to plan in the first year of his administration, if he wins, $400 billion to invest in energy and climate research and technology. He's saying that what we need to do is use American innovation. As I mentioned, America has been the greatest innovator in the last 100 plus years, in not only in the world, but probably in history in terms of the number of patents and new developments. So if we have this whole kind of past of research and development and innovation, Joe Biden says we should reinvigorate that and have that, use that to do climate research and technology. For example, with grid storage, inventing more batteries and new refrigerants and new fuels for airplanes, although he doesn't mention electricity. And he does also talk about railroads, which is interesting, saying that he would invest in the Northeast corridor that exists to improve on it, but he would also start creating more corridors between of highly trafficked areas between Washington D.C. and going farther south, between in California, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, between a number of in Washington State and in Oregon. And so he's talked about using the railroads more. He also talks about, and I'm not sure some environmentalists or many environmentalists might question this, research in nuclear power. Now, Bill Gates had said that he was working on trying to find a cleaner and more stable form of nuclear power. And he was about to try an experiment by building that. And the only place he could build it was in China. And the day that he was about to go to China to begin that project, the Trump administration and the US and China got in a trade war, so everything was stopped. So they never got to examine that. Now, in talking about this, what this has to do with the politics of this is that in order to beat Donald Trump, Joe Biden has to reach to both the what we'd call centrist Democrats, and some would argue moderate Republicans, but also the young people. And the young people have said, registered young voters have said that climate change is one of the top 5 issues they wish to be addressed. And if you look at the Green New Deal and Bernie Sanders again said for the Green New Deal, he wanted $16 trillion compared to what Biden is calling for 1.7 trillion. So Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal was about 10 times more expensive and more comprehensive and probably would have come a lot faster. And I think his date was a lot sooner than 2050. I think he was aiming for 2030. So this is, and the organizations like Greenpeace have said that they're calling on Joe Biden to immediately cease digging for oil, gas, and coal. I don't know how well that would go with some of the Republicans, even moderate Republicans, but this is what Greenpeace is calling for. And the only concession that Joe Biden has made toward that at this point is that he would give out no new permits for fracking. Hydraulic fracking is fracturing, is where you drill into the ground and you send in large amounts of water and some toxic chemicals and to hit shale rock. And when it hits, and basically it forces out from the shale rock when you hit with high pressure oil and natural gas, and also methane, which is a key greenhouse contaminant and contributor to global warming. So, but it also pollutes the environment in terms of what comes out. So there are a lot of problems with fracking, but this is one of the things he said: no new permits for fracking, but that there were plenty of old permits around. Although there were about 800 hydraulic fracturing rigs in the U.S., and now it's down to 460 because of the oil glut. So, but there are plenty of them existing now, as opposed to stopping them completely, which is what Greenpeace had called for. Now, one interesting thing is that Joe Biden did a podcast. A number of environmentalists have recommended that people listen to that. He did a podcast with the Washington State Governor, Jay Inslee. Now, Jay Inslee ran for president. He dropped out, but he ran for president on a basically climate change agenda. And his entire team his entire climate change and climate crisis team is now reformed to try and work with the Democratic nominee, or to try and work together to try and get more climate change going in the U.S. But Joe Biden did have a long podcast with Jay Inslee. It was very deferential toward him. And so that has to be something that some environmentalists at least are saying is a positive sign that maybe Joe Biden now is listening more to the environmentalists, because Jay Inslee is definitely someone that many environmentalists and environmental organizations and activists have supported. So I've talked long enough, about 20 minutes on this, but it's let's go on. Let's see. It's Paul B says that, quote, and I am telling you, no technology will work in separating false positives who are hot for other reasons. Okay. Ha ha ha, says Kalita. I'm not sure what that's about. Carl Jones said he'll pay $9.99. I think he's saying that if Jonathan Larson can do a Mitch McConnell impression. Can you do a Mitch McConnell impression, Jonathan? Well, Jonathan's not here today. He will be back tomorrow. And Jonathan does this this TYT daily webcast Monday, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. I do it Wednesdays and Friday. So let's see. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm looking at something from the other day or if I'm looking from something here. Okay, somebody pointed out that it says, quote, Obama permitted a lot of oil fracking. I don't know if that's true. That would be an interesting point. Barack Obama was a Senate president. He was not as far to the left as Bernie Sanders, if you define it that way. Definitely didn't term himself to be a democratic socialist. So I'm not surprised that there would be some things. And the interesting thing to wonder about is we do need oil and gas at this point to basically power the energy in the United States and power airplanes. Well, once the pandemic is over, power airplanes, cars, etc. If we all support a transition, how fast does this transition have to occur? Well, clearly it has to occur before 2050, so that's 30 years. Can we do that transition in 10 years? And one of the things that I have found in studying this is that a number of oil and gas analysts are now saying a couple of things. One, they're saying that it's time for these fossil fuel companies to begin investing in renewable energy sources. That the fight, basically, they have to realize that they're losing this fight and ultimately it will be lost. And these companies to survive need to start switching over to renewable energy. The second thing that I noticed is that a lot of or at least some key analysts, not with the oil companies themselves, but analysts of the oil and gas and fossil fuel companies are saying that when you go to Congress, they're saying they still want to bail out the fossil fuel companies. But on the other hand, they're also saying that what they want to see is a quid pro quo. In other words, they're saying, hey, Republicans, ask for a bailout, ask for the Trump administration to buy millions of barrels of oil and put it in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, but at the same time, offer some kind of tax credits to renewable energy companies. Now, under the Obama administration, a lot of the renewable energy companies had tax credits and they were taken away by the Trump administration. So the analysts are saying, hey, Republicans, offer to the Democrats this kind of quid pro quo, say, okay, bail us out now and we'll let you have your tax credits back. So that's something to think about. One other thing I've noticed is that the oil and gas industry talk about all the layoffs, unfortunate layoffs, and in the coal industry for many of the workers. And they use that as a reason for a bailout. But there are right now more workers in renewable energy, 3 million workers in renewable energy, at least according to the Biden campaign. And according to some reports I've seen, 100,000 plus just in the solar industry have been laid off. And I don't see a lot of people, certainly I don't see a lot of Republicans talking about those layoffs. I don't see a lot of the Democrats talking about it either. So that's something that probably should be brought up. So now let's go to some more. Cheeky saying, I'm sure we could find an alternative. I didn't see what else you were saying, an alternative to what, but yes, this is an interesting point too, although I do say interesting a lot about a lot of things, and that is that Michael Moore, or Jeff Gibbs in his movie, executive produced by Michael Moore, Planet of the Humans, did point out one major point that I thought was very accurate, and that is that we have to re-examine our present level of consumption. This pandemic is also going to force us to examine our present level of consumption. And that is, once the pandemic is over, assuming that it is, if there's some kind of treatment for it, like Tamiflu or a vaccine, Do we go back to the way we were before? And in terms of the climate, is that sustainable? And that I think is a big question. For example, all the if we go, I don't know, like you look at nighttime in all the cities in the US, lights everywhere, everybody's going at night. Should we go back to what we used to do in the farm days? And that is when the sun goes down, people go to bed. And then you get up when the sun comes up. Or should we do more? And Ben Franklin's adage of early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. So that's one thing. Other things, this whole thing with plastic bottles and plastic recycling not really occurring. Do we have too many plastics? Do we stop that? Do we, for example, stop flying so much? It's not only do we come up with a better fuel, do we actually say, okay, let's stop flying that much? Every time you fly, it's like 500, it's like tons of carbon released into the atmosphere. Just watch a jet plane take off from an airport next time. Look at the kind of exhaust that comes out of it. So do we change our entire lifestyle in the world? And certainly the United States as probably the number one, not probably, but the number one polluter in the world, that we have to take the first steps. And we're polluting mainly because of our consumption and our lifestyle. Does that need to change? So I think that Katie Kane talks about hemp alternatives. Okay. So, and then somebody else, I missed their name, but they said, take the tree. And I think that's a terrific idea. Also, I just bought an electric bicycle. Instead of driving the car to go to the supermarket when I'm up in my cabin upstate, my supermarket's 2+ miles away. We jump in the car, we go there, and I thought, well, I could just put a backpack on, jump on the electric bicycle, put on my helmet, and go down the 2 miles, fill up the backpack, and come back up the 2 miles. I can bicycle as much as I can. And then because it's very hilly where I am, then I can use the electric portion. The electric bike, they're on sale now. Mine was like 40% off because so few people are buying. So this is something I've wanted to buy now for nearly 5 years, and I've waited because it's just too much money. Finally got one. So now let's get back to someone is saying that the UN votes to build a wall around the United States. Well, I don't know what that means. The UN has no power to do that. I think people should remember, if you don't study history, who said that? Santayana said you're doomed to repeat it. After World War I, they tried to develop something called the nations, so that countries would talk to each other before they go to war and millions of people die. And then after World War, and that the U.S., although President Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. president at the time, wanted to support that and actually was a big supporter of it, he couldn't convince Congress, and the U.S. never entered the League of Nations. But after World War II, probably because of the experience of having 2 world wars, where I know in World War II, 68 million people were killed. After World War II, the UN was developed so that countries would talk to each other. So something like a global pandemic, we have the World Health Organization. If we stop talking to each other, then we're not sharing knowledge about, how to deal with this pandemic, sharing knowledge about the virus. China did share its information with the World Health Organization, although at first it probably delayed giving it, but it publicly said, and I don't know if this is true, but this is a public statement by the Chinese Foreign Ministry or something like that. They said that on January 3rd, they delivered to the World Health Organization all its information they had at that time about the COVID-19 virus or coronavirus. So that was January 3rd. In a lot of countries in the world, US included, not just the US, we can't just say only Donald Trump, but a lot of countries in the world, for example, Italy and Spain, which have pandemic and epidemics now, they did not pay attention. A lot of countries did not. So, but it's important that we have that ability to share. So that's my push for at least global sharing of knowledge. If you don't want to, even if you're nationalistic, it doesn't make sense in a global world where we're connected by airplanes and all you need is one person coming to the country to contaminate the entire country. Uh, Everyone should watch with their families. Okay, I missed that one. It's up. Let's see. Someone has pointed out if China is advancing the green energies, what can we learn from China about that? Well, one thing about is production. This was a fascinating documentary that's on Netflix that compared the American work style with the Chinese work style. There's a glass manufacturer came to Ohio, and the glass manufacturer, the Chinese workers worked 7 days a week. Basically, only holidays once a year was the Lunar New Year or Chinese New Year for 2 weeks, and then they were used to working 7 days a week. And the American workers went, that's abusive. What's wrong with you? And so the bottom line was that the Chinese workers, that the American workers were lazy and didn't work fast enough and hard enough. And the American workers thought the Chinese workers were basically abused and worked too long, too hard for not enough benefits. And so there was that clash of cultures there. And we have to think about, how do we make a decent living, treat workers properly, but still be able to compete? And I think Joe Biden might have something there in terms of research and development. The one reason why the US has been able to have its economy survive, not the one reason, but a key reason, is that the US has always been able to innovate and come up with a new product that everybody else wants, and then we sell it to the rest of the country. So there was a question about what Japan's reaction to this agreement, to the Paris Accord agreement is. I don't know the answer to that. I can try and look that up. But I will tell you this about Japan. Also true about Germany, and that's their recycling. That when you recycle in Japan, you actually recycle into 10 different categories. So while we, for example, in New York City, we recycle basically into 2 categories: paper products and a whole category of glass, metal, and plastic. And those are the 2 categories of recycling. In Japan, and I don't know the exact number in Germany, but I know in Germany they also recycle into many more categories. But in Japan, they actually recycle into 10 categories. So clearly they have a separate plastic recycling, glass recycling, metal recycling, paper recycling, at least 4 more right there. But they also have 6 more different categories. And that probably is how we should be recycling as well. That if we can recycle in many more categories, at least 4 or 5 more categories, at least 4 or 5 total categories, it'd be a lot more efficient. I mean, think about it. If millions of people recycle, and people do accept recycling, accepted it more faster than politicians and even environmentalists thought they would do in the 1980s. But would they also accept? I think people would accept, okay, we got to at least recycle in 4 different categories: glass separate, metal separate, plastic separate, and then paper, and probably a couple more, because you know that most of the plastics are not recyclable. Only the category 1 and 2 are recyclable. Some 3, 4, and 5 and other categories, the majority of plastics are not recyclable, and they end up in landfills. Not only that, even the ones that are recyclable are not being recycled because there are just too many of them. So what's happening is all we're doing is storing them. At one point, we sent all our recycling to China, and they used that. But China's gotten to the point where even it was too much for them. They said there's nowhere to put it anymore. So China stopped taking the recycling, and now the U.S. has nowhere to put the recycling, even the ones that plastics that are recyclable. So that's something that we have to consider. So I'm going to try and get on my laptop here some more of the comments, and because I see them on my phone, but I don't particularly see them. Okay. It's annoying they say Moore is criticizing the left. No, Moore is the left. He's criticizing corporate Dems for moving to the right. Okay, so that's more on the political nature of this. So is Michael Moore criticizing? Okay, I guess we're talking about the movie The Planet of the Humans. So that was actually written, produced, and directed by Jeff Gibbs, executive produced by Michael Moore. In that movie, they talked about, number one, the consumption thing, that we have to re-examine our consumption and our level of style of living, that it's not sustainable, it's not renewable. We cannot continue to live the way, basically the wasteful way we're living, no matter what kind of sustainable energy sources we come up with. So, but the thing that I had a question about on that movie, which I thought was not accurate, was they focused a lot on two examples. One example was on biofuel energy, and those biofuel, the majority of them burn wood. And in this movie, The Planet of the Humans, saying this was a terrible way, and I kind of agree with that. Trees down, tear more down. So I agree with that. But the other thing too is they showed on a pristine Vermont top, mountaintop, they were putting up wind turbines, and how this wasn't going to work because if the wind isn't going, they're going to have a fossil fuel plant, and they're destroying this beautiful mountain. Well, that may be true for that one case, but the reality is, and also they showed that how at one big rally, one of the environmentalist founders of the environmental movement was saying how this whole rally is powered by solar power. And they went and checked and said, not true. Maybe the microphones, its loudspeakers are powered by solar, but most of it was powered by diesel engine. So what was interesting about that is that when I examined it, if you look at the US EIA, United States Energy Information Agency, the renewable energy sources now provide, in this first quarter of the United States, 17.2% of the 17.2% of the electricity generated in the U.S., which is more than coal was generated for the first time at 17.1%. Coal used to be 50% 12 years ago. So what happened was when you examine it, actually, the greatest sustainable energy source is from hydropower, like the Hoover Dam, 7.3%. Second is wind at 6 point something percent. And then third is solar at only 1.8 to 2%, so very small. And everybody's always saying, every time we talk about renewable energy sources, it usually is, oh, solar, wind, blah. But actually, that's not the reality. The reality is hydropower, wind, solar, and to a much lesser degree, biofuel, and then even less than that, geothermal. So what Michael Moore was pointing out, certainly about our consumption was accurate. I'm not so sure what he was saying about our sustainable renewable energy sources was fully accurate. It was accurate in pointing out that we're not there yet with solar, but they left out this whole thing of innovation. Excuse me. They left out whether we can innovate to make solar panels more efficient, deliver more electricity, be cheaper to make. Right now, solar panels, compared to when they were first created, some at least 50 years ago or more, are 99% cheaper. And that is a benefit of capitalism and manufacturing, that when you do mass production, the more you make of something, the cheaper and cheaper you can make it and to make more of them. So let's get some more comments, because I'm already been yapping here for 39 minutes and 33 seconds. And if you put up a comment, here's a comment. Use passive solar at home to cut utilities. And this is from Katie Kane. And use better glass. Well, that's a good point. In New York State, for a while, there was a program for people, at least in rural areas, that you could reduce by 10% your electricity bill if you signed. And so that's something. We have a lot of wind and solar farms in New York State. And I know in my residence in New York City that I have one portion of my electric bill is completely coming from sustainable wind and solar. So I think that'd be a good idea. But this is expensive. And so maybe if Joe Biden is correct, in saying that if we can do research and development and find a way to improve and cheapen and make cheaper, solar energy, then maybe a lot more people would use it. Right now, it costs like up to $30,000, or it can cost anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000 to put solar panels. That's a lot of money, especially at this time when so many people are not working. 25 million people are not working. So the this is not just pie in the sky, because the person who invented the Segway, that little thing where you ride one big wheel, fortunately he drove it off a cliff. But before he did that, this inventor was working on paint that would also provide energy from solar power, that you would paint your rooftop or paint your house, and then that paint would generate electricity. He was working on that technology. That would be a big game changer. Then people could be using that kind of paint to paint their homes and provide electricity for it. So in any case, let's look at one more thing. Okay. Katie Kane says, you're asking better questions than she can answer now this quickly. So, but they're also talking about each other's pictures and complimenting each other and that. So I think it's time for me to say goodbye, or as I like to say these days, stay safe and be healthy. And this is T.Y. Chang from TYT Investigates. Please check out tomorrow. Jonathan Larson will be here, 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And please check out TYT Investigates and all the Young Turks channels if you can. And again, be safe and healthy. Bye-bye.